Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Rausen Pereira. Well, Paytm and Google have been at loggerheads in recent times, especially after the latter removed the former from its Play Store. To support Indian app developers, the digital payments platform on Monday launched a mini Android app store to support local developers to take their initiatives to the masses and across the country. Paytm said that it will provide listing and distribution of these mini apps within its app without any charges. For payments, developers will be given a wide array of choices. More than 300 app-based service providers have already joined this platform. In this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze the India app story and ecosystem. Joining me on the program today are Vishal Gondal, founder and CEO, GOQii; TV Mohandas Pai, chairman, Manipal Global Education and former director, Infosys; and Ramesh Kailasham, CEO, indiatech.org. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. TV Mohandas Pai, I'd like to begin the program with you first. Let's first try and understand and analyze why do we need an Indian app store or a homegrown app store?
Well, today most of the apps are on the Apple system, which is iOS, and Apple by agreement does not allow anybody who is not iOS to come there, and you have to abide by a one-sided contract, or on the Android Google store, and Google has got a one-sided contract too. Now what happens when you're there? These are digital monopolies. They work by contracts. You have no protection. You have to pay money to Apple up to 30% for being on the App Store and any revenues that you earn. On Google, you don't have to pay. But Google can shut you off. They decide what has to happen. They have a set of people who decide. There is no right of appeal. Then you have to fight it out, as happened to Paytm, etc. Now, those are pretty good when you have a small number of apps. But for a large country like India, it's better to have your own app store where you can have all of them come and they can get protection of a set of regulation, which is done by a regulator, but not a one-sided contract. And all these are stored outside India in their data centers under their control. And they get the data of everything that happens in the app, who downloads, what do they do with it, who buys, all the data goes to them. And that data is extremely valuable. And that goes outside the country. So you have created two monopolies, which created their own system. And this own system are making them more and more bigger monopolies. And when India grows bigger in this area, we'll be at their mercy for whatever they do. They can shut the whole system down. They can do what they want. They may not do it because there's a fear of the law. There's a fear that they'll be shut out of business. But I think time has come. For example, China has its own app store, right? China doesn't allow Google. China doesn't allow Facebook. China doesn't allow Twitter. But that's a totalitarian state. We are an open society where everybody can come in. But everybody comes in, they have to obey the rules of the country. Of course, sadly, we don't have rules yet in this particular place. But I think it's time for India as a very large digital power to have its own app store and manage it so that more and more access can come. Nobody will squeeze you. Nobody will take away all your money. Money does not go out. And it is for the internal market largely.
Okay, so it's for internal consumption and also to get rid of the monopoly of iOS and the Play Store and to keep the data safe is what Mohandas Pai is suggesting. Let me bring in the other panelists into the picture as well. So, Ramesh Kailasham, let's talk about how something like this is going to help Indian startups, how something like this is going to help Indian developers and young, probably software engineers who can come out with more such apps.
If you look at the ecosystem today in India, I mean, we are one of the biggest contributories to the app ecosystem. We are a producing country, if I say so. Because globally, if you see, I mean, out of the 170 odd countries that exist, there are certain pockets which are producing such apps and the rest of the world is consuming them. So globally, if you see today, there are 2.7 billion, which is around 270 crore smartphone users, of which, I mean, as per latest data, we have 500 million smartphone users in India. One of the fundamentals for driving smartphone, the app consumption is the smartphone market. And statistics reveal that we will add another 300 million more in the next couple of years. And with the pandemic, the urge to consume more of an app-based economy has increased. The digital transactions are increasing. So we are actually at that threshold where India is moving further, faster ahead towards the digital economy. Now, coming back to where we stand, as Mr. Mohandas Pai already mentioned, is that currently, while there are 300 plus app stores around the world, largely the play is dominated by two players who also have, I mean, one of them also has control over the handset. So it's a complete lock-in kind of a scenario we are in. And if you look at even the algorithmic openness, it doesn't exist in most of the cases. So Indian developers naturally had an affinity because of the Java-based environment we had to lean towards Android. And plus, of course, the affordable smartphones that existed were largely leaning towards the Android, which is why we allowed, in a way, Android to have 95% of the market. But I mean, Android as such, if you speak to any developer, would say it is open source and free. But what comes in the version of Android is bundled with proprietary software that comes from Google. So in a way, there is significant amount of lock-ins and lack of openness, plus more importantly, lack of transparency that exists on the way in which I can actually go about with my business. Plus, of course, if you look at the development process, it is dependent right from, I mean, there is money, if I use the term continuum of development of app in India, there is payment at every stage, right from development to listing to functionality dependencies to even distribution, which is fundamentally what these app stores do, to payment gateways and, of course, the government taxes. So in a way, if somebody says, I'm going to bring in 30%, I'm left with nothing. I'm running this business for charity. So it is all the more important that there is choice available for the app developers. There is openness in this whole market. There is transparency of rules. And as you said, I mean, there is the need possibly for an more and more India-based app stores to develop for choice, not only for the developer and the startups, but also for the consumer to decide on what kind of options they want to go for.
Absolutely. All right. So let me take the discussion forward and go back to a point that Mr. Pai was making. You know, Vishal Gondal, I'd like to take that aspect up with you because your company, GOQii, in fact, has a lot of data, a lot of personal data that it uses, you know. So this issue of data privacy, data protection, how can this be addressed through a homegrown app store? And how important is this particular aspect for companies such as yours?
So first of all, let me give you the simple example of why this issue of Google taking down Paytm is of such high importance to our country and to the startups. Today, Paytm is a bank. The only person who can decide to shut Paytm or not is the RBI, who governs the banking system. Similarly, as startups, we are governed by different regulators, different government authorities, and finally, maybe the courts can decide if a company is going to remain open or shut. But what has happened today is by Google on its own arbitrarily removing Paytm, it was like they were superseding the authority of even the RBI. There were millions of people with so much money in Paytm Bank who suddenly did not have access to it. So it is not just about somebody taking down an app. The question today is, as we know, we are moving towards a digital India where we are talking about all digital services being used by people on their mobile phones. But suddenly Google has given this jolt to everybody and made everybody realize that we have absolutely no control over our own destinies. Similarly, at GOQii, for example, a lot of the Google ruling has been arbitrary. Clearly, when you look at now, they have introduced or they have now delayed the thing of charging 30% on fitness services. Now, in this whole COVID scenario, everybody is accessing virtual health, virtual fitness, and the idea is to make health and fitness more accessible and more affordable to people. But by imposing a 30% tax, they are trying to exactly go and hit companies where they know they are going to be able to get their pound of flesh. So if you look at the categories, they suddenly talked about education because we are seeing a sudden surge of people using online education. They are asking about fitness because more people are using fitness. So the challenge right now is that we currently have a system which does not respect the laws of our country, does not respect the framework which has already been set, and they're imposing their own rules. I want to stop by this statement by giving you a recent example where we at GOQii and my other company, we are launching the new 4G game which should be launching pretty soon. And we have had massive issues. There are 500 fake 4G apps on the Google Android store. And we've been struggling for Google to take down these fake apps. So at one end, there is a challenge to bring down fake apps, and there are millions of people downloading them. And then Google suddenly wants to take down Paytm because of maybe its own commercial interests. So I think right now, while this was an example, and thankfully Paytm is back on the store, but I think what has really happened is this has suddenly made all of us realize that all these companies who are operating in India, they are not having the best of India's interest in their mind. They are driving with their own profit interest. But we as a country, as digital is going forward, and our Prime Minister has envisaged the digital India, we need to make sure that the digital assets of our country are protected by us with our laws and our policies, whether it is data, whether it is governance, whether it is which app should stay and which should not stay, should be decided by us, not somebody sitting in America or anywhere else.
Absolutely.
Vishal is very right. If you can say something,
please do.
Like the East India Company coming again and trying to rule over us. We can't have another East India Company. We know the damage that they did. In the virtual world, Google and Apple have become like the East India Company of earlier time, which took over a country, coming here on the guise of trade.
So Mr. Pai, since we are here, let me ask you a follow-up question and take this particular aspect forward. Both panelists have already addressed this issue of how the foreign companies are only interested in commercial aspects and safeguarding their own interests, and probably, playing to masters sitting elsewhere and not in India. So let's talk about some of these unfair rules and how do we address them. Do we need some policy level changes? What is it that we need to do from an immediate point of view, and what do we need to do in the long term?
Well, I think one way for the government to do is to maybe declare Google App Store and Apple App Store and Twitter as public utilities. I don't know whether the laws allows them, because as a public utility, government has the right to regulate them if they operate in India, and force them to keep all the apps of Indians in a data center in India to which government has access, and then ensure there are no conflicts of interest. You'll be very surprised. Just yesterday in the US Congress, the Democrats came out with a report saying that Google and Facebook and Apple have deep conflicts of interest. They spoke about the Apple App Store of Apple. They spoke about Google. Because they manipulate, they got conflicts of interest. For example, in Google search, if you pay more money, you come on first. You don't get what you want to see. They send you what they want to see based upon the money they get. So they don't have the interest of the consumers at heart. Maybe that's right, because there's business. How do consumers get protected when it's become a public utility? It's like the power that you get. Power is a public utility. Telephone has become a public utility. Earlier, 100 years ago, maybe 70 years ago, when telephones started growing up, they were not a public utility. Suddenly you found they could not be shut out. And that's why a large country like India, smaller countries can't do it. Like Ramesh said very rightly, we are a producer. We are not a consumer. We are a producer too. A large country like India needs to have an app store, which is in India, where the data is stored in India with very clear rules, with right of redressal, right of appeal, and you should have somebody regulating them so there are no conflicts of interest and there is no arbitrariness and there are fair rules. And that can only come if it is in India and is an India app store. If Google wants to run the India app store, it's fine. They can come and set up an app store in India and only for India, and others can come and do it with very clear rules. If Apple wants to do it, it's fine. And you know that Apple does not allow anybody else, any other icon for a Play Store on the Apple phone. They don't allow. Only their icon for the Play Store has to be there. So they logged you in and they got a monopoly. And we don't like monopolies. We want open competition. There is no competition with both of them because they're so big. They make so much of money. They can outspend everybody. They employ some of the best lawyers, some of the best public activists and everybody else. So I think the time has come for a country like India to do it. Vishal is very right. Tomorrow, Vishal becomes very successful. They can shut him out. Then what happens to poor Vishal? What happens to all these millions of people who play the games, right? And tomorrow, like Vishal said, if RBI is a regulator for a bank and the bank app is shut out for whatever reason, because some small guy somewhere in a remote corner of the world thinks that doesn't comply with this policy and interprets it, what happens to everybody else? So there's no consumer protection, There's no protection for the producer. It's all by agreement. It's worked well so far because everybody was saying it is okay, but it's not going to work in future. So the time has come.
Absolutely. I think very well put and very rightly analyzed there by Mohandas Pai. Let me bring in another aspect altogether now. Ramesh, as far as this particular app store is concerned, Paytm is talking about a mini app store and not a full app store. Firstly, what is the difference? Secondly, shouldn't we have something that is on par with the Play Store or an iOS store?
Yeah, if you look at the current dependencies that exist, I mean, most of your handsets, and this is where I would like to bring the handset part of the story. When we were looking at what are the costs that an app incurs today, and the reason why Paytm was forced to create a mini store was the fact that the main app store had own set of conditions which were not appearing to be fair for all the app developers. So if you look at it further, the reason for this skewed kind of model is primarily because in this case, both Google and Apple concerned not only own the Play Store or the App Store, but they are also developers themselves. So in some ways, they are also competing with most of the apps that exist. So do the rules apply in the same way to them as it would apply to anyone else? We are not sure of that. The second part, of course, is that if you look at the current app store that exists, it has a lot of dependencies in the sense that because you buy a handset which is bundled with the Android, which is bundled further with all the aspects that Google has brought in, embedded into the whole thing, your dependency is primarily on the app store, that is Play Store, that is given by Google. Any environment you create, again, has to further be an embed into this and is not independent in nature. So while Paytm has brought this mini app store or whatever, the dependencies continue because the foundation on which the whole ecosystem of the market today is built, right from the handset to the Android that is embedded with bundled proprietary software, the dependencies all go to one particular stack in either of the cases that you look at. We cannot get away from that unless the fundamental player here starts saying that we are open for allowing other app stores to come in. Apple does not allow that. Google has given a statement that they will allow that in the coming future when they are coming with the new version. But the challenge there is they have not stated the how part of it. Whether a further Play Store for me to coexist along with me will now pay me something as a cut, we are not sure. Those models have not been clarified. So there's a lot of gray zone that exists today in this market.
Absolutely. All right. So, Vishal Gondal, for all the reasons already we've discussed so far in the program over the 20 minutes or so, can a company like Paytm take on a behemoth like a Google? And what is it that other Indian companies need to do, or what is it that the system needs to do to support a company like Paytm?
Well, I think, what Paytm is doing is the right strategy. It is what is called the super app strategy. Already millions of people are coming to Paytm for their payment requirements and using all kinds of e-commerce and other transactions. And now while customers are coming there, they want them to discover other apps and services. So it's a great start. Of course, Google's policy does not allow them to become a full app store today. So part of the reason it's a mini app store is not because technically they are not capable. It's because Google stops them from becoming a full app store because there are certain permissions required which only Google can give you to install apps, and there are a whole host of things we can get into. But I think the challenge right now is that in the limited construct, what is possible Paytm has done. And I think other companies, Amazon, Flipkart, Uber, Swiggy, Zomato, anybody today who has a huge amount of traffic can start these mini app stores. But I think the bottom line is, and I think this goes back to our Atmanirbhar strategy. The challenge is that if you see bulk of our mobile phones are Chinese phones, which are not the country of India in the first place. So once we have more phones being manufactured in India, they can potentially even start embedding or putting Indian app stores into this. And while some limited amount of app stores are coming, for example, Samsung has its own app store, Jio is planning an app store. I think the bottom line over here is that unless Google opens up its operating system, which it does do, the Android system for selected people, their selected partners, it is possible, like handset manufacturers, but others don't have the same facility. One other thing I just wanted to kind of touch upon quickly was around what the government can do. So the government has the IT Act. And very interestingly, recently we got a court order against Facebook, Twitter, Google, Instagram, all these social media networks and platforms, where the court directed them to remove some defamatory content and videos from all their platforms. And you know what? None of their companies, Indian entities, are even refusing, planning to comply with this order, because according to them, they are not an intermediary. They are not serving the internet. They are just giving ad services. So the problem is, while Google India wants to collect revenue, they want to impose the 30% tax. But when it comes to taking responsibility of the content, their official position, which they have submitted in the court, is that we are not an intermediary. We are just the people servicing the US client. Everything is controlled in the US. So I think that the government needs to study the role of all these companies who are operating in India, collecting revenue from Indians and Indian companies, and make them responsible like any other company who does business in India. So I think they are really trying to, in some way manipulate the system to escape their liability under Indian laws. And
Right.
that is the problem. So whatever we end up doing, they will simply say we have no power. It's the US companies who do it, and they don't follow Indian law. So I think that's really the problem over here. And from a law perspective, the government and the Competition Commission and all the other authorities should study this aspect very clearly.
Absolutely. All right, time to get closing comments now from all my guests with the best way forward. Starting first with you, Mohandas Pai. Let's talk about how do we improve the ecosystem as a whole, right from the beginning stage where we produce great talent to a final finished product.
Well, first of all, like Vishal said, I agree with him. We need a law. The government has to study and bring in the law. Maybe they can study the Democratic Party's document placed in the US Congress. It talks about conflicts of interest, what need to be done, etc., and bring in the law. One novel thing is to maybe declare them as public utilities if they work in India, because I think they know how to regulate public utilities. That's point number one. And point number two, have somebody like a NCPI, a National Payment Corporation of India, is a quasi utility which is well regulated, to create an app store. Yes, an app store requires a lot of technology at the back end. It requires a content management process. It requires a process to audit and to verify, and it requires a huge capacity on the cloud, etc. All that a utility like that can do, and they can ask them to do it in the payment space and take on other spaces, etc. Because most of these apps that are in India, Vishal, if I'm right, are used in India, right? So the India market is very big for them. Of course, we can allow, if people want to go outside India for their apps, they can go to Google Store and put it there. We don't care, because some other countries' problem, and they can as well pay 30%, but not in India. So we need these two things to be done, and then government should have an inquiry. We should ask the Competition Commission of India to have an inquiry about monopoly abuse, use of monopoly power. Remember, in the EU, European Union, their regulators who regulate competition have penalized Google heavily. And even in the US, they want to bring in the antitrust laws against all these big global monopolies to open up the market. So globally, the world has realized the threat. And it's time government of India also realize it and start working on this dual track.
Absolutely. Ramesh?
Yeah, if you look at the challenge that is emanating and which is being felt by the startup ecosystem, is the lack of transparency that currently exists. So I think a free and open model should be the way forward, and a government could step in and create an environment and set of regulations that will kind of unlock this market, both from the handset standpoint, and probably create a free and open model that allows competition and empowers consumers and developers to decide where they wish to operate upon and which is the environment they want to live in. Apart from that, of course, it is also necessary that if you want this particular ecosystem in India to grow, I mean, the Prime Minister did mention that India wants to become Atmanirbhar and create multiple apps and solutions. One of the things that he mentioned was gaming. Now, if you look at gaming is not allowed in different forms in the Google App Stores. And at the same time, if we want to emerge as a destination, any arbitrary regulation or a commission that is like 30% and so on can actually finish off that ecosystem in India. So I think even from an ecosystem nurturing standpoint, we have to look at it strategically.
Absolutely. And Vishal, close the show for us with your quick concluding remark.
I would say that this is not a Paytm and Google fight. This is a fight for the nation. As a country, we are seeing this challenge because it can potentially harm the good for the society, because we may not have access to the utilities we want. It may be very bad for our national security because people can use these platforms to do all kinds of slander and enjoying the whole benefit of being anonymous because these platforms refuse to disclose the information. And thirdly, as a startup, you are already having so many challenges as a business, creating a business model. And now you are having this complete uncertainty that Google can shut you down or remove your app, or Apple can shut you down and remove your app, and you have no recourse. You have no way to do anything. So I think this is a much larger issue. And of course, the startups need to be united. And I'm happy to see Paytm taking this first move of doing the mini app store. But I think this is just the first step. This fight is going to be much longer and will require a lot of endurance from everybody. And my only hope is that we all will be united. Unlike the East India Company, which was able to divide and rule, we need to be united and fight.
Okay. A call for unity there by Vishal. I hope we see that coming through and through. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. What's coming out of this discussion is that it's high time that we have a homegrown app store to keep the data safe and to get rid of the monopoly of the Apple App Store and the Play Store. An app store that can be regulated and plays by the rules and not indulge in unfair practices is the need of the hour. We need a law to deal with the entire issue, also a regulator who can look at this issue holistically. Lack of transparency is a big problem. We need a free and open model, and we need our Indian startups to be united, is what the panelists are suggesting. With that, it's a wrap. See you again next time.